Most exciting thing ever, but I was able to retrofit my sewing machine so that way it can sew this thicker thread on leather. Hello guys, I'm Exa and welcome back to my channel. For today's video, I'm going to be showing you some tips and tricks for how I was able to update a regular sewing machine and embroidery machine to work with some thinner cow leathers. So I'm not going to do too long of an intro on this one, we're just going to go ahead and jump right into how I was able to retrofit these machines and some issues that I tried to resolve along the way. Okay, so first we're going to talk about the physical products that I purchased to change out these machines. So there were two main pieces that I used. The first one for a regular sewing machine is to get a Teflon presser foot instead of the normal metal ones that most machines come with, because it will allow the leather to move more smoothly underneath of that presser foot than the metal ones. It tends to like stick to it and then it can kind of slow down and jam up your machine. So I definitely recommend getting a Teflon presser foot. And obviously if we're trying to sew the leather, the second and probably most important thing is to get a leather specific needle for your sewing machine. These ones look pretty much just like any normal sewing machine needle, except they are extra pointy. I'm pretty sure you could also use some of the thicker upholstery ones meant for like denims and other just like thicker fabrics and materials, but you want to make sure that you're using a fresh needle and it is nice and sharp, because a dull needle will probably bend and break. And the last piece of converting a regular sewing machine to handle leather is to make sure that you're using an appropriate thread. You want to make sure that you are using a synthetic thread. The natural fiber ones tend to shed and have little fuzzy bits, which I found can kind of jam up the machine, and they like get stuck in the leather and don't glide through it as easily as a synthetic fiber like the rayons and nylons will. So another note is to make sure you're using a synthetic thread like this one. You can usually tell they're synthetic because they're going to be a lot more shiny than their kind of natural fiber counterparts. So this one is actually a cotton thread, and I don't know if you can even see it in here, but like see there's like little tiny fuzzies coming off of it. Those are bad for leather. It tends to kind of get stuck and it's more easy to jam your machine. Also, they're not going to be as strong for holding up to the wear and tear of most leather. But when using this nylon thread, as you can see, it's not going to have any of those little fuzzy threads coming off of it that are going to make it stick to the leather, and it's going to be able to guide much more easily. You want to be careful about the thickness of your thread. You definitely don't want one that is too thin, because you are working with a thick leather and it could tear and break easily. But don't go with something that's going to be too thick for your machine to handle. Make sure to look up what the thickness is that your machine can properly run through. Especially for the bobbins, a lot of times the top threads, it's totally fine. You can use any thickness as long as it's fitting through your needle. It's not really going to jam, but the bobbins tend to be a little bit more finicky. So with that, the first tip is make sure that you are replacing your needle regularly, so that way it's always staying nice and sharp and able to cut through that leather. I had been using one for a while to complete one of my projects. Check the link down below to see the wonderful Christmas present that I made for my mom. And after I finished that piece, I was working on something else, and all of a sudden my needle was more dull and it just could not get through the same leather, even though I had been sewing the same exact leather for the last like 2 hours, and it bent the needle. And long story short, because of bending that needle, I ended up messing up the timing on my sewing machine, and it did not work, and I could not fix it myself, and we had to go to the local sewing shop to get it repaired for $100. So tip number 1 is really important. Make sure that your needle is always nice and sharp and will be able to easily cut through whatever material you are trying to sew, to save yourself the trouble of breaking your machine. So the second tip I found is, if you are working with thicker leathers and you are having a hard time getting your needle through it, go really slowly. So here's a clip of the actual speed I went when I was sewing only one piece of a relatively thin leather
on top of a just fabric zipper edge. So I am going pretty slow, and if I'm working with a thicker leather than this, I would go even slower. This one is about a 3 to 4 ounce thickness, just so you can get a reference point of how thick I'm working with.
At one point with mine, I even ended up just using the manual wheel to sew the entire section, so that way I could slow down and guide it and make sure that I wasn't going to try and jam up my sheen, and I could smoothly get through the leather that I was trying to sew.
So this video is not sped up or slowed down or anything. This is the actual speed at which I was really slowly sewing through these two pieces of leather because they were kind of thick and hard to get through, and I wanted to make sure I wasn't going to jam my machine.
I'm just gonna cruise on through. So you can see it does get a little stuck sometimes, which is why we're doing this by hand, because we're going through so many pieces of leather. My third tip is to use simple stitches and patterns and make sure that the spacing between each stitch is wide enough for the leather that you're not going to end up just ripping completely through the material. This is going to be a lot bigger of a deal if you were trying to embroider the leather. I found with me at least normal zigzag stitches and normal straight stitches, as long as I just extended the stitch length a little bit, it was completely fine and worked great with the leather. If you're trying to do some of those funky decorative patterns that some machines have, then I would recommend testing it out before you get down to the project you actually want to work on, and just see if that pattern will work with the leather or not. So with the embroidery, you definitely want to make sure that you're not trying to put too many stitches close together, because it will just tear completely through the leather. When I made my logo for my shoes, I ended up just doing a simple line file just to spell out the words, because that was the easiest to make sure that it would hold up to the pressure of having a person's foot walking around on it all day. So I can't totally speak to a lot of more complicated designs, because I just really haven't tried that many of them yet, but I'm sure I will at some point, and I will post a video about what things I tried that worked and didn't work. But in addition to just doing really simple kind of line files, I would say satin stitches work pretty well with this. You just make sure that you are updating the stitch density on your software you're using to build your pattern, or if you're getting a pattern from somewhere else, just make sure that that stitch density is really low, so that way it's not trying to put too many stitches too close together, which will again tear through the leather. Also keep in mind, if you're doing a more complicated pattern, no matter the stitch type, having sections that kind of go on top of one another, or like line up at seams with like a lot of stitches together at once, is probably not going to work very well with the leathers, because it is definitely going to weaken the integrity of the leather by having that many holes on top of each other. So here you can see an embroidery with a simple stitch, and then I also just tested out a couple other little stitch patterns. I tested just a couple of the kind of like basic stitch patterns. So here's like a straight stitch, a fun little X pattern, and then a normal zigzag stitch, and they all worked perfectly fine on this leather. Yeah, I have black thread on the back, so that's kind of hard to see those lines, but as you can see, it worked perfectly fine on the one layer of leather, and this is a thin lining leather that I'm working with right now. I definitely wouldn't recommend trying to do any sort of intricate designs or embroidery stitches on a thicker leather than like maybe a 3 ounce. This one is only a 1 to 2 ounce. It is like super thin and soft and pliable, and meant for linings of things, so it's going to be a good easy supple leather to get through if you're trying to do any fun intricate designs. So the fourth and final tip that I have is make sure you're using thin enough leathers for your machine to handle. Even though we can retrofit our regular sewing machines to sew leathers and denims and other thicker upholstery fabrics, it does not mean that they can handle all of them or lots and lots of layers together. So do make sure that you're using the thinner leathers when you can, if you're going to be doing multiple layers together on your machine. And if you can't, then you can skive the thickness down a little bit on the edges where you need to put in your seams if it's just a touch too thick to get through your machine safely.
So to trim down the edge where I'm going to put the stitches, since I want my stitches to be about a ½ inch from the edge of the material for this particular piece I'm working on, so I'm just going to really carefully skim my little blade, it has a razor blade in the middle of it, along the material and shave off a tiny bit at a time until I've gotten it to about the thickness of leather that I know my machine can sew.
So guys, now that you know all of the ins and outs for getting your regular sewing machine to work with some leathers, be sure to check out part 3 of this series of me actually using the sewing machine to sew some leather. Don't forget to subscribe and hit that little notification button so that way you can stay up to date on all of my fun and crafting adventures. There's going to be a lot more shoemaking and leather sewing up in the future. Until next time, I hope your day is as beautiful as you are.